Howdy folks, welcome back to the Steampunk Desperado channel. I'm Vaughn Troide, I'm your host, and I am the Steampunk Desperado. Today we're going to be talking about one of the classic forerunners of steampunk fiction, a kind of sci-fi western, if you will, that aired in the 1960s. It was a television series on CBS called The Wild Wild West. It was created by Michael Garrison and it ran from 1965 to 1969. It starred Robert Conrad as Jim West and Ross Martin as Artemis Gordon. They were two secret agents in the late 1800s, and they were in the Secret Service. They protected the country from all sorts of evildoers and nefarious villains. Now these guys were like cowboy James Bonds. They had all sorts of gadgets and gizmos and many cool guns and weapons, and they had their own headquarters, which was a train of their very own, had its own engine, a couple cars behind where they could ride in style. This was really popular back in the 1960s and was one of my favorite shows as a kid, next to Star Trek, of course, the original one. You know, with Captain James T. Kirk, the best captain of all, of course. But back to steampunk. This show was so popular, and so many people loved the idea of combining sci-fi and a western, that we remembered it when steampunk became a thing, when it became popular in later years, and people looked back and said, this really was one of the first examples of steampunk. So the Tucson Steampunk Society, when they have their annual convention down at the old Tucson, at least the ones I've been to were there, and they called it the Wild Wild West Con in honor of the Wild Wild West, of course. They tried to incorporate a lot of historical elements. They would talk about President Grant, for example, and they had villains who also had gadgets that they had to oppose. Now, one of my favorite things about this show was its cool theme. I'm not going to play it for copyright reasons, but I might sing it a little bit for you. It used to go da 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 da, like a very classic Western neoclassical style. They had this really awesome graphic that came up at the beginning of the show. It was looked kind of like a painting or a watercolor in a collage form, where they'd have different pictures of typical Wild West things, like a gunslinger, a soiled dove type of lady, and somebody pointing a gun, whatnot. And as the show progressed, this is one of their gimmicks, every time they would break for commercial, they would freeze the scene and change it so it looked like a painting and stick it into the collage, so by the end of the show, it completely changed. Now, one of the things about the Wild Wild West is it wasn't completely serious. I mean, at the time, if you did a Western, and Westerns were really popular, Westerns were serious. They tried to stick to historical type settings and real historical things, whether they were as accurate or not. I'm sure they weren't, whatever people thought at the time. But the Wild Wild West, of course, introduced these science fiction elements and these special conspiracies that were always going on. And in that way, it reminded me a lot about Batman, because the original Batman series with Adam West, there was a lot of action, a lot of fight scenes, and some of them were a little silly. Some of them were a little over the top. And the plots could be ridiculous at times. One of my favorites is there's this rich fellow, for some reason somebody wants him dead, and he's playing his piano, he's playing his grand piano. Somebody has stuck a crossbow into his piano, and unbeknownst to him, when he hits a certain key, it fires, shoots him in the chest, and he dies. How more Batman-like can you get? And in any case, it was pretty amusing. And another time they had a turkey tray, one of these big dome trays like you might see at a Thanksgiving feast, and they had a shotgun rigged up in there so that when they pulled the tray off it would shoot them in the face. Things like that. They had some pretty cool villains, as you may have guessed, to think of crazy ideas like this to kill people. One of my favorite villains was a guy called Miguelito Loveless. He was a Spanish dwarf. Oh, I can't say that. Little person. He was a little person who played, he was like the evil genius. He was like very much a James Bond villain, and he was one of the more recurring characters in later seasons, and he was played by Michael Dunn. And so that was part of that campy but fun atmosphere. You do occasionally get a chuckle out of some of the things that go on there. I know I've watched a few episodes recently on YouTube, and you think, wow, when I was a kid, these were so amazing, and now they're kind of weird sometimes, but they are still a lot of fun. Now, as you may remember, in the 90s, there were a lot of remakes, a lot of movies based on old classic TV shows. From The Addams Family and I don't know, a lot of them. Let's just say a lot of them. And one of them was The Wild Wild West, of course. And the stars of this show, our two heroes, West and Gordon, were Will Smith and Kevin Kline. And the love interest was the lovely Salma Hayek. Always enjoy seeing her in a movie. Now, I love all these three actors. And Will Smith in particular is great. Seemed a little jarring seeing an African-American West, particularly in an era when racism would have made that pretty challenging for him. Nonetheless, it was a good idea, a good premise. It just didn't work that well. For whatever reason, the movie wasn't really that popular, and as a Wild Wild West fan, I didn't think it really captured the spirit all that well. My biggest problem was that they introduced, they kept Loveless in there as the primary villain, but they changed him too much. He was no longer a little guy. Instead, he was this embittered Confederate war veteran called Arliss Loveless. Where have I heard Arliss? Where have I heard that name before? They had to work this little bit of political correctness in there because we have a black secret agent and we have a Confederate guy who's all angry and stuff because his side lost the war. So it didn't feel as genuine to me. Even though we will review that at some point, talk about it, and tell you what they did right, what they did wrong. As far as the series, it remained popular through its entire run of 4 years, and yet it was canceled, which was very sad. And I never knew why at the time, but I went back and did some research. And it turns out it was sacrificed to the hysteria over TV violence. And it's really funny when you think about what they considered unacceptable violence back then in the 1960s, which was pretty tame and pretty unrealistic, let's say, violence, because you shoot a guy just like on High Noon and whatever, you shoot a guy, you don't see his intestines splatter into the street. You just see him fall over in the street and he's dead. So it's kind of sanitized violence. But nonetheless, I guess the network figured they had to sacrifice something to satisfy all the people who were making the hoopla, and they canceled Wild Wild West. CBS did do a movie-length sequel on TV in the 1970s sometime. I haven't seen it. I'm going to try and find it somewhere, watch it, and give you a review of that as well. And because it's Wild Wild West, we have to do it. It's important. It's part of our steampunk culture. In summation, every one of these reviews, I'm going to give a rating like any good critic should. For steampunk, we do gears. So it's going to be a 5-gear system with increments of half a gear. In this case, the case of Wild Wild West, the original series on CBS, I'm going to give it a rating of 4 out of 5 gears. The reason I'm not giving it a perfect score is because it's a little silly, frankly. The silliness distracts a little bit from the enjoyment when you go back and watch it. Nonetheless, it is still great. I still do recommend you look it up, and I believe you can get like DVD sets and so on from Amazon and wherever. So go look for that. For now, I want you to give me your comments. Let me know whether you liked this episode, what you would like to see in the future. I want you to come back and see us again for our next review, which will be coming here soon. But for now, this is Vaughn Trady, the Steampunk Desperado, saying adios amigos from the Steampunk Desperado channel, where the past meets the future and the present is extraordinary.